Okay. Let me spend some minutes on explaining the rationale underpinning the design of this conference. I will touch 3 points. The first one, what has the integration process been about over the last 50 years and the limits of the integration project, the way it's been carried out so far. Point 2, the fact that the boundaries between internal and external policies are increasingly being blurred. That is to say, the distinction is no longer so clear between internal and external policies. And the third point, the increasing importance of EU external relations, and that is why this conference focuses precisely on external relations. So let me start with the first point. What has the integration process been about, and how it has been carried out, and the limits of the approach that has characterized so far the integration process? You all know that so far the integration process is largely concentrated on internal policies. I want to underline internal policies, with a major emphasis, again this is nothing new, with a major emphasis on economic aspects, and largely relying on output-oriented legitimacy. That is the capacity to solve collective decision problems by resorting to what? Corporatist and intergovernmental agreements, the input of affected interests controlling key resources, rather than the input of all citizenry under conditions of political equality. Finally, efficiency has been more important than democracy. So what is it? I'm trying, obviously, this is just putting it in a very short way, just in a few words, but the integration process has been carried on over the last 50, 60 years, largely, as I said, concentrating on internal policies and on the basis of this particular logic. Intergovernmental agreements, a great role of the experts. Now, actually, way back 10 years ago, Stefano Bartolini, the author of a very important work, Restructuring Europe, hinted at the limits of this institutional approach. Let me quote from his book, because I think that he actually 10 years ago foresaw the problems that we're now facing. What did Stefano Bartolini say? He said, decisions based on relevant actor participation, on independent authority impartiality, on policy networks, and on techno-bureaucratic technical expertise can hardly generate a different and new type of legitimacy for those outside the narrow circles of the participants to these processes. To abuse the concept of legitimacy generates the risk, and I underscore this, of miscalculating the extent to which true legitimacy surrounds the European institutions and their decisions. Once again, he uses the term miscalculation. This miscalculation may lead to overestimating the capacity of the EU to overcome major economic and security crises, if and when they will emerge. Now, you all understand that now is the moment. These major economic and security crises, which Stefano Bartolini speculated about 10 years ago, well, they have materialized. This is for sure. So let's start with the economic crisis. What is this bringing to the forefront? The financial and economic crisis that has been ravaging economies in Europe has brought to the forefront the fact, and we've discussed it in class many times, that social and spatial redistribution can hardly be pursued without the kind of thick identities that have underpinned the development of European national welfare states. So I'm saying that even by focusing just on internal policies, there's a problem. We're not able to face current challenges that call for redistribution among countries. But this is just one part of the question. The second point I want to make, so the institutional architecture that has been built over the years doesn't really work, is showing its limits. But the second point is
In the current context, a number of internal policies can hardly be isolated from what is going on at the international level. What is it that I'm arguing? The internal-external distinction, with an almost total disregard of the external dimension by the EU institution and member states' insistence on maintaining full control of foreign policy matters, does not hold any longer. So I'm talking about the second problem. It is impossible to keep distinct internal and external policies. The blurring, as I was saying, using this expression, the blurring of the boundaries between internal and external policies. Now, this is something that scholars have argued for a long time concerning national states. We've been saying you can't keep this distinction between what is internal and external, but we were actually focusing on the relationship between the EU and the supranational level, the EU level. But now this same concept applies to internal EU policies, external EU policies. It is hard to keep this distinction. Let me give you a few examples to clarify why this is a new situation that we have to deal with. Let's consider, for instance, mobility. Well, we all know very well that free movement of labor has been one of the core elements in what? In the whole integration process, in the economic project, free movement of labor. The emphasis, we know it very well, the emphasis on the four freedoms, you know, capital, labor, etc., services, whatever. This has been a core element, free movement. In terms, how was it perceived? How was it articulated? It's always been articulated as a matter of rights accorded within an internally regulated European space. There was a clear distinction for a very long time between what was mobility, what we intended as mobility, and what we intended instead as migration. Mobility has to do with something that's internal. Migration is from outside. In fact, we speak of third country nationals. Now, but in fact, this distinction is subject to increasing contestation. This is what I would like to highlight. Commission pressure to enhance the application of EU-wide regulation of free movement in member states has taken place against a backdrop of anti-immigrant and EU sentiment among anti-EU sentiment among European publics. For instance, let me just give you an example. In 2013, April, Germany, Austria, UK, and the Netherlands sent a letter to the Commission asking to review free movement legislation. So what is at stake? Where's the problem? On the one hand, we're insisting on free movement, but then there are security concerns that are coming to the forefront. What's the trade-off between the two? So the fact that you cannot encapsulate even mobility legislation, mobility, freedom to move around, is bringing to a what? To a reconceptualization of mobility, not as a rights-based European category, but rather as a risk and as a challenge to security. For instance, just think of what's happening, the concern about EU citizens traveling through other EU countries on their way to fight in Syria, Libya, and Iraq, and in case returning. Or even think of the call to revise the Schengen arrangements. So what I'm arguing is we cannot just continue concentrating on the blah, blah, blah of the internal market. A lot of these policies are tightly connected to the external dimensions that cannot be ignored, no longer ignored. But I've mentioned the mobility migration nexus, but I could even talk of the digital union. Digital union, insisting on protection of data, insisting on privacy, but cyber, by definition, cyber is global. So to what extent freedom of the internet undermines our security? What is at stake is critical civil infrastructure. They can be easily attacked by anywhere, and you don't even know where the attack can come from. So we can't just think of the internal policies for building this digital union. There are connections with the external dimension. Think of just what happened to Estonia a few years ago, a major attack that practically put the whole country in trouble. And where did that attack come from? Not from inside, it came from outside. So in fact, surveillance, the word quote-unquote surveillance, is a central concept of the Festival of Europe that is taking place during this week in Florence, surveillance. As Commissioner Oettinger, I can't pronounce his name, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, recently stated, we are working in 28 fragmented silos. 28 fragmented silos, the idea of fragmentation of the policies pursued by the member states. But can we afford it? Is it possible? Is it in our interest to continue working in this way? And to add something else, there need to be some kind of coordination between cybersecurity, which deals with the civilian sphere, and cyber defense, which in fact instead deals with the military sphere. These two areas are tightly interconnected. You can't keep civilian issues completely separated from the military. And the technology is the same. And we all know that, in fact, as far as the information is concerned, cyber defense, there's more coordination within NATO and NATO structures. But how does this relate? And how can we relate this to what the EU is doing? So as you see, there's an intermingling not only of internal and external policies, but there is also an interconnection that has been largely overlooked, an interconnection between different policy areas at the external level that require some kind of coordination. Just this is really a minor example, but in the statement by the special meeting of the European Council of 23 April on migration that we'll be talking in the first session, we'll certainly be touching also on that. That statement envisages, I'm quoting, the use of Europol to detect and request removal of internet content used by traffickers to attract migrants and refugees. So you see, we're talking of migration, but in fact, the statement by the Council is actually pointing to a problem of coordination of Home and Justice Affairs, of Europol, etc. So we can't keep these policies separated. To make a long story short, internal and external dimensions cannot be sealed off. This is the basic message that I'm trying to send out. Cannot be sealed off. And the external dimension of the EU is becoming increasingly important. Our national leaders have always focused on the internal dimension, building the internal market. My argument is the time for that is gone. We need to consider the external dimension more seriously, and that's far more important than the internal quarrels that we have. Europe, let me just say a few words on that. This is my third point and concluding part of my introduction to this conference. Europe is losing ground, even in economic terms. By 2030, Europe's share in global GDP will substantially decrease. Now the figures are different. Different sources present different figures. I'm just quoting a work by Daniel Gross and Cinzia Alcidi from the think tank CHAPS, one of the most important think tanks in Brussels. Now, what do they say? They tell us that the share of the EU is in global GDP, so the wealth produced around the globe, the current share is 22%. Okay, by 2030, that share will go down to 70%. So we're going to lose another 5 percentage points in terms of the relevance of our economy on a global scale. Whereas, you know very well, there are other parts of the world, the emerging economies that are growing. By 2030, while Europe will be 17%, will contribute by 17% to global GDP, China will contribute 25%. So what will be the role of Europe in 20 to 30 years in this context, considering the emerging economies, Brazil, China, India, South Africa? Let me add, it's not just an economic issue. I started with economic data because we're always focusing on economic financial data as if the rest of issues didn't matter at all. But in my view, it's not just an issue it's not just an economic financial issue. It's a geopolitical issue. So this conference, the aim of this conference is to shed light on the degree of divergence, convergence of member states in 5 crucial areas that pose challenges for the European Union. These crucial policy areas I'll start from Migration, definitely. When I decided to organize this conference about 4 or 5 months ago, I put migration first place, and unfortunately is even more in the first place now. Second, international crisis. Should we sort of forget about what's going on in Ukraine or Northern Africa or the Islamic State? So that's going to be our second session. Degree of convergence, divergence between member states. This is the bottom line, trying to focus on that. 3, cybersecurity. And I've said a few words. Cybersecurity is crucial. As I said, the commissioner himself said that we're working in 28 silos, so, which means every country is doing whatever they wish. 3, organized crime. How are we going to deal with organized crime if we don't consider, I don't know, where the drug comes from or whatever else, Colombia or whatever? Obviously, organized crime has an international dimension that cannot be ignored. And 5th area, energy security. Can we just concentrate on building an internal market, on building a network where energy can flow from one country to the other, or do we have a problem of where do we get the energy from? Where does it come? The security of our supplies. So as you see, the program is very dense. But to be honest, perhaps I should have added another panel. I didn't because there was really no room for it, but I regret that I did not add another panel on development cooperation. Let me just, a few words, I'll conclude on this. So far, okay, despite its ambitions, the Commission has been the default donor. In its document, An Agenda for Change, the Commission itself, it was 2011, the Commission said, the Commission is the 28th donor. Obviously now it would say it's the 29th. But the idea, the 28th donor means once the member states have decided what they want to do and what they don't want to do, the leftovers go to the Commission. In the Agenda for Change, as I'm sorry that I'm critical, but I think that this is the kind of work that we should be doing in universities, in academia, not sort of being talking the truth. In the Agenda for Change, the Commission itself said we cannot continue doing everything everywhere. Everything everywhere. So what I'm arguing about is we need to prioritize, we need to concentrate our efforts, we need to find out, to actually have a strategy, because if we're going to do everything, we're not going to get anywhere. This is very important, especially if we think of what's going to happen. There is the post-2015 strategy ahead. In September 2015, we're going to decide about post-2015, that is, after the Millennium Development Goals. But are we facing a clear reorientation of these policies? Are we finally addressing the sort of the faults that the Agenda for Change put to the forefront? Do we see clear priorities? Actually, I'm not so sure that this is happening. There's about 20 different things that are going to be pursued, which means no priorities, no concentration of efforts. And let me quote that development cooperation is important, for instance, for a continent such as Africa. Africa is crucial for the future of the planet, and this doesn't seem to be so well understood by the European Union and EU member states. Let me quote, I often quote it because I think that it's paradigmatic. I had an interview with the Deputy Minister for Energy of Tanzania, and I asked him, what is the role of the EU in your country? What is the role of the EU? And after some courtesies, he replied, he used just one word, but I think we can all understand what that word is: insignificant. Insignificant. And at the same time, if you ask anyone in Africa, what's the role of China? Don't worry, they know what the role of China is about. So I hope that this kind of statement, insignificant, at some point in the near future will no longer be plausible. Obviously, this is wishful thinking, but I hope that at some point in time our national leaders will understand that it is not worth keep fighting amongst each other while the European Union is gradually losing ground, as I said, on a global scale. So this is the background to the conference, and we can now start with the first session on migration. So thank you.